Thank you, TJ. So I have the pleasure of presenting many of our findings, which I'll hand over to Nicola in a moment as well. Our report itself is a review of disability inclusion throughout ASEAN today. And more than simply this review of what is taking place today, it's also a look into solutions that are emerging from social entrepreneurs. Some of these social entrepreneurs are, of course, a part of our call today, and we'll get to hear from them directly during the roundtable discussion in just a moment. And in the meantime, we get to set the stage for understanding much better the issue of persons with disabilities, as well as the opportunities for social enterprises throughout ASEAN today. So a few notes on the context for this study overall. As the ambassador shared in part, it's estimated that 1 in every 6 people live with a disability in Asia and the Pacific. And of course, disability in this context refers to any type of intellectual, mental, or physical disability. And of course, with such a significant population, boosting the social and I would like to add the word full here, boosting the full social and economic inclusion of this population represents crucial opportunities for societies. And I believe, as most of us on this call are aware today, social enterprises themselves are businesses focusing on social benefits in addition to financial benefits. So these are the types of twofold organizations that essentially provide both the social services of nonprofits as well as the business revenues of companies. Social enterprises themselves are, of course, a recent and very rapidly growing phenomenon across the ASEAN region. And within this particular study on disability throughout the ASEAN region, social enterprises in particular have emerged as key actors who are capable of developing innovative and scalable solutions to promoting the full inclusion of persons with disability throughout the region. And fortunately, we get to see a number of very exciting and compelling examples of those social enterprises throughout our discussion today. And it's also worth adding, as you'll see throughout this presentation as well, that many of these social enterprises are led by young social entrepreneurs themselves. And many of these young social entrepreneurs are themselves persons with disabilities. This is a very interesting trend in parts of the innovative approaches to doing business that we'll learn about more throughout the discussions today. And as I move through some of the key findings of our report, there are really 5 very topmost key messages that we're interested to share with everyone today, starting with, of course, number 1, disability inclusive employment represents a great social and economic opportunity for post-pandemic recovery. The ambassador addressed this a bit in his opening remarks as well. We truly have a very unique opportunity at the moment to reevaluate many of the frameworks that are in place today. So of course, like many other vulnerable groups, persons with disabilities have been disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic. And throughout the pandemic, persons with disabilities, this form of vulnerability that they've experienced is mainly increased difficulties in accessing public services such as health, education, and other support services. However, they have been significantly impacted in many other ways as well, which I'm sure we'll be able to address more throughout our panel discussion in a moment as well. And it's also worth adding here that persons with disabilities still continue to face barriers to accessing these services, which may lead to worsened discrimination against persons with disabilities themselves, such as employment discrimination in particular. You'll hear this topic mentioned a lot throughout our conversations today, as employment discrimination in particular is one of the most rampant or pervasive challenges facing persons with disabilities throughout ASEAN today. Lastly, on this particular finding, studies show, of course, that the GDP of Asia Pacific countries could rise by 1 to 7% overall if we're able to provide disability inclusive employment sectors. And of course, we add this economic figure, which is so important. And then it goes without saying that the social inclusion cannot be quantified in the same way as the also very critical economic inclusion for this population. And our second key takeaway from this report is that social enterprises have emerged as key actors for identifying new solutions and fostering the inclusion and empowerment of persons with disabilities. So truly the key message of all of our conversations today and the main finding of our report overall. Of course, social entrepreneurship is itself a growing phenomenon, both worldwide and within ASEAN. And in fact, according to the UNESCAP and the British Council, up to 1 million social enterprises are tackling social and environmental problems across Southeast Asia today. And in many ASEAN countries, social entrepreneurship has built upon the evolving history of cooperatives and shown significant growth in recent years. And this is quite unique, of course, for the Asian region, that there's already such a rich cooperative history to be built upon. And so many of these social enterprises are founded and established so recently. For example, in Singapore, over 90% of existing social enterprises have been established only since 2010. Again, that's over 90% of the existing social enterprises. And about 67% of these have been operational for less than 5 years. So it's truly a growing trend increasingly. And even in Indonesia, over 70% of social enterprises have been established in the past 5 years. And lastly, the rise of social enterprises in the region reflects both a need for social innovation and the growing demand for purpose-driven enterprises, especially amongst millennial consumers. According to the World Economic Forum, 40% of millennials report that they believe that the goal of business should be to improve society. Millennials make up 40% of all consumers today, influencing about $40 billion in sales worldwide. And our next truly key takeaway from the study overall is this very interesting trend that most of social enterprises are led by young social entrepreneurs, many of whom are persons with disabilities themselves. So trends in entrepreneurship worldwide have shown the growing emergence of young leaders, which is true in the ASEAN region as well. And of course, persons with disabilities have considerable assets to leverage in advocating for disability rights, in particular, their own firsthand knowledge of their needs and the ability to develop effective solutions to social problems. I believe it's really these trends, as well as this point on self-advocacy, that help reinforce how extremely well-positioned these social enterprises truly are for addressing inclusion throughout ASEAN. And I'd actually like to share a quote from the founder and president of Virtualahan, one of our participating social entrepreneurs who wasn't able to join us today. This quote from Ryan during one of our discussions for this report, he shared, "We are now beyond the good for business case, that it's good for companies to hire people with disabilities. True inclusion is when you build mechanisms for persons with disabilities and everyone to thrive, including in the workplace." And of course, social enterprises have emerged as key actors for their capacity to identify new solutions in situations where there may be inadequate policy protection, as well as private sector inaction. And an increasing number of social enterprises are offering vocational skills and recruitment support for private companies to foster disability inclusion. So again, as we mentioned earlier, the very important topic of employment discrimination. Employment discrimination is being significantly addressed and increasingly addressed by these social enterprises today. And in fact, the majority of social enterprises supporting persons with disabilities in ASEAN have one or more of the following objectives: to provide education, skills, or training to persons with disabilities, to create jobs and provide direct employment for persons with disabilities, and to support the employment or job placement of persons with disabilities with external company and organization partners. Of course, there are a number of social enterprises supporting persons with disabilities addressing other areas as well, but it's really this main topic of employment discrimination that is increasingly represented today. And of course, I'll share a couple of examples that we'll get to hear about much more in a moment. So in the technology sector in particular, there are many social enterprises who train persons with disabilities in tech skills, which of course increase the individual's employability, as well as their potential for higher earning income. And in the hospitality industry, many social enterprises train persons with disabilities in the skills needed to work in high-performing restaurants, coffee shops, bakeries, and a wide variety of other companies. And as a segue to Nicola's conclusion of our study, I can add here that governments across ASEAN could significantly help advance social entrepreneurship that supports persons with disabilities. One of the key findings, of course, is the importance of policy support, not only for implementing the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities, but also for supporting the actual structure and establishment of social entrepreneurship throughout the ASEAN region as well. And with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass on our concluding recommendations to Nicola.
Thank you. So as explained, I believe very clearly by Allison, the contribution of social enterprises in supporting people with disability in the region is significant, and the potential contribution is even higher. But what our analysis, I believe, has shown very clearly is that these potential cannot be realized if social enterprises in the region are not adequately supported by a conducive ecosystem. So the report puts forward recommendations for basically for 5 categories of actors that could and should do more to support social enterprises in the region. So first and foremost, as mentioned already, governments that, of course, as explained in detail in the report, can do more to strengthen the national regulatory frameworks related to both social enterprises, so the way social enterprises are defined and treated, and the disability rights. Second, also obviously corporations, as we know, can do a lot to advance disability rights and inclusion, basically by promoting the equal employment and pay of persons with disabilities. The third category perhaps is one that we don't discuss enough usually, foundations and philanthropists. We found that from analysis of basically what foundations in the ASEAN region support, that disability is pretty much neglected as a topic. So it is clear that foundations and philanthropists could do more in terms of providing strategic grants, strategic support to social enterprises in the region, working on this topic. The fourth category, very important, in my opinion. We all know that we live the years of the rise of finance that is labeled as responsible or sustainable or ESG. So we are talking about immense resources. So we believe that these, or at least part of this investment capital, could be very, very useful to support social enterprises, and needs to focus a bit more on the topic of disability. And then perhaps last but not least, social enterprises themselves. We found that, and this is certainly not the case with those that are with us today, that our organizations are extremely robust and well structured. We found that many social enterprises working in this case, in this field, are not particularly well structured, and in particular, they often struggle to quantify and to demonstrate their impact. So there is a bit of homework, of course, to do also on the side of the social enterprises themselves to get ready for these other actors to then support them. So these are, obviously these points are developed more in details in the report, and I would like to just conclude by saying that it has been an incredible learning journey, and we would like to thank the social enterprises that are doing a fantastic job every day on this topic in this region, and from these organizations we have learned a lot, and so we're particularly grateful to them. Thank you.